piece about Iitate, Japan, which was subjected to the extreme radiation from a Fukushima nuclear reactor. Japan is the only country in the world that has suffered both a bomb, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a nuclear catastrophe. So there are many anti-nuclear environmental activists in Japan. It's a big movement. What would they say about Iitate and people coming back there? It's not a good idea. It's a terrible idea. So in the protest movement, the anti-nuclear activists, which he acknowledges it's a real force, in their idea, it's like, no, places should be abandoned. On the other hand, what does the Japanese government say about this place? What does the state, Japan's, huh? They wanted people to go back. In fact, some people have accused the Japanese government of forcing people to go back. But basically, it's fine. We cleaned it all up. We're monitoring it, and it's all better now. So they wanted to showcase this as a place that had been bad, but they'd been able to clean it all up. Basically, this is a crucial dichotomy that Tam is setting up at the beginning of this chapter between the perspective of the activists and the perspective of the government. But what he says is that both of them are relying on these external scientific measures. They're both relying on these expert opinions from the outside to measure various levels in the soil. And so he calls them that this is two sides of the same coin, or a kind of dichotomy, right? So what he says is that you have on the one side the activists, the environmental activists, and the Japanese government. They seem to be completely opposed, but it's actually just using the same instruments and the same external measures to come up with this flip-sided approach. And what Tam is trying to say, things are much more complicated than that. In fact, there were some people who apparently stayed on. Most of it was a forced evacuation area, but now people are starting to come back. They don't really support the government idea that everything's fine. They're not about to throw in a bunch of vegetables and start eating them right out of their gardens. They're trying to use these flowers in order to regenerate the soil and create this, what he calls an ecology of optimism there, that they're trying to do this. Now, he is going through this organization called, abbreviated as LIFU, which is Living Together with Fukushima, which is not the only perspective. There are people who left the town and will never come back and want to be compensated and want to be protesting. But this organization is interesting because, again, it's not necessarily supportive of the official government line that everything is fine, but it's trying to do something different here. Who are these people, Simi? Who are these people who are coming back? The older people who are coming back. And he gives 4 examples of people and the flowers that they are cultivating. I wish he had more. I wish he had more pictures and descriptions of these flowers. It's too bad. I found some of these not in Iitate itself, but in other places of Japan where they apparently like their flowers a lot. So these are what he calls Narcissus japonica or suisun in the Japanese, or we might know them as daffodils. And these were cultivated by Hirosawa. What do you think of Hirosawa? As they say, they used to grow rice. Instead of rice, he's putting in these flowers, but he cultivates them as if he were growing rice. And so we're talking about tens of thousands of these daffodils all over the place, which then result in frogs and insects and other animals coming in and even doing a hiking trail around the place. So this is beginning story, which again, the stories are also sad and traumatizing, of course, but he's starting to come back to life through the planting daffodils as if it were rice. Sunflowers, also huge. It wasn't quite as successful as they wanted to be, but there were some pretty big success stories with the sunflowers, in part because of the radiation, the fact that all the people had to leave for a while. You have macaques coming back. Macaques, by the way, are monkeys in Japan. Even bears and goats, things he said that hadn't been seen for decades. And some animals that they didn't really want, like the boars, they were coming through there and are still a problem in some ways in there. But the good thing is that these sunflowers, all those other animals like the wild grasses, but the sunflowers keep those wild grasses down. What else do? They improve the soil. So we don't know if they're ever going to be able to grow anything there, but they seem to improve the soils for future cultivation. So what do we have? Daffodils, sunflowers, cosmos. This is a picture from Tokyo, but I like these too. One of the 10 best places in Japan to see cosmos. Here we have the story of Sugiyama, who doesn't like the sunflowers as much and wants to plant these. Cosmos. Tam says that for him, they represent an ethical responsibility, individualized flowers to regrow the land. So, the last flower, the fourth type of flower, the Turkish bellflower, Kiyozakisa. You can get this from Etsy and grow it in your own place. These were cultivated by Koiki. So he's the only one who's gone back to just growing things to sell them, which they used to do a lot in this area. And now they're not really doing that anymore for obvious reasons, because people don't want to buy irradiated stuff. But he actually is trying to sell his stuff. So he's, as he put it, he's as if the nuclear disaster had never occurred. What he says here is that if you follow him around in his everyday activities, it is a departure from the narrative of abandonment and forgetfulness, emphasizing new alliances and solidarity. So we have these four examples of people who are cultivating flowers, and in a landscape that is, nobody really knows exactly how irradiated it is. And so what he says about these returnees, going back to the first point, is that you have this official idea, right? You have one official idea from the environmental activists and the anti-nuclear activists that you should leave this place and showcase it as the ills of radioactivity, whereas the Japanese government wants to say is, we're good, we're all clear here, go back and live there, to the extent that some people have accused them of forcing people to live there. And what he's saying is that these are dichotomies. These are two sides that are opposed but don't capture the complexities of life. So the dichotomies are of safe, unsafe, to say unsafe, safe, since we put in that order, and of certainty, uncertainty. So on one side, people are like, this is totally good or totally bad. And what he says is that if you are inhabiting this landscape, which is, again, it's going to be radioactive for a while, but people are still there and trying to make these lives. So they calls it uncertain and unpredictable, yet also possible. So for him, he's looking at these returnees, and he says that they have what he calls double resistance. They are against the narrative or the idea of abandonment. So they're obviously back, they've returned, they're completely given up on the place, and they're not necessarily protesting it anymore, but they don't necessarily trust the government and its all clear, all safe message either. So they also are angry at the continuing insistence or the plans that the government has made. So again, it's an interesting, both in terms of the actual stuff that people are doing, the flower cultivation, the animals, the life that's come back there. But in a larger way, it's trying to say that we have to watch out for these two-sided dichotomies which don't capture the complexities of how people might be able to live in this environment. So he again, at the very end, calls this persistence. That persistence is a resigned form of resistance. So here they are, they're not necessarily fighting it out on the streets with activism, but they persist there, and that is a form of resistance. And he urges us to embrace the hopes of people in all their diversity. And he's urging the anti-nuclear activists to understand this as well. And this goes well with the chapter that we read about Greece, because in fact, it's about the plurality of hope, or how people have different hopes. Not always, they don't always fit into our models of one side or the other, but there's all these different ranges of diverse hopes